bound to him that weren't necessarily bound to others within the law. So, just starting again, we'll go really quick through the first part of this. And Jehovah said to Moses, as he always does, that's how this begins, to make sure that we understand that this is not coming from Moses, this is coming from God who is speaking through Moses. Jehovah said unto Moses, speak unto the priests. So we understand here that this injunction is given to the priesthood. Not necessarily to everyone else, but certainly to the priesthood. The sons of Aaron, say unto them, and it goes into the concept of you shall not defile yourself for the dead. Why do you think this was necessary? Well, this was certainly the case of those of the Canaanites, the ones who were driven out before the nation of Israel. The Hebrews, God had driven these people out. The land vomited out its inhabitants, and many of the things that he gives injunctions against, while in and of themselves were not necessarily wrong, they were wrong because God said they were wrong. And one of the reasons was that God wanted to differentiate his people, the Hebrews, against all the other nations of the land of Canaan. Because they did certain things, God didn't want them to do those things. And look at some of those. There shall none defile himself for the dead among his people, except for his kin that is near to him. So what are some of the things he did? For his mother, for his father, and for his son, and for his daughter, and for his brother, and for his sister, a virgin, meaning that was a sister that had not been married, was not outside of his household. He still had authority over her that is near to him, that hath no husband. For her may he defile himself. He shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people, to profane himself. They shall not make baldness upon their head, meaning the idea of shaving their head for the dead, or cutting a specific unusual haircut. We see this was very common amongst the Canaanites. The idea of priests were they shaved their heads ritually. In many cases, they took all the hair off their bodies. No eyebrows, no beard, no hair on their head. But of course, God told the Hebrew men what? You're not even supposed to trim your beard. You allow your beard to grow naturally. Okay, so this was to definitely differentiate themselves between the children of God and the Canaanites that they had taken the land from. All right, shall not make baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corner of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. The idea about what? Ritualistic cuttings. Many times the priests of those pagan gods would make cuttings in their flesh, and they would treat the wound in such a way that it would leave a permanent scar, so that it would be very visible to people that might see them. This was not done underneath the clothing. This is in their face, on their arms, something that would be very, very visible to everyone else. They shall be holy unto their God, and not profane the name of their God. All right, let's continue. Another one down, continuing on just a little bit. And the daughter of any priest, if she profane herself by playing the harlot, she profaneth her father, she shall be burnt with fire. What do you think this is in reference to? What would he be talking? Why would he feel it necessary to talk to the daughter of a priest to tell her not to profane herself as a harlot? It was a very common thing for these pagan temples to engage in cult prostitution. And in many cases, the women that were actually involved in that cult prostitution were the daughters, and in many cases, the wives of the priests that were serving in those cult temples, those pagan temples. And it was ritualistic. It wasn't just so they could earn a little money on the side. That was part of the worship of these pagan deities. A worshiper would come in and he would pay for the services, prostitution, and in many cases the women that were involved in that were the daughters and the wives of the cult priest. So here he's saying, once again, to differentiate, then you're not to do this. Now, this is really kind of he's repeating himself, because it was very, very specific to the children of Israel that they weren't engaged in this kind of behavior even outside of that. No matter what it was for, you weren't supposed to play the prostitute. That was a business, and that was an industry that was forbidden the children of Israel. But here he's saying even more so because of the differentiation between the children of Israel and the pagan temples. Okay, so very specific. Continuing on in verse 10, and he that is the high priest amongst his brethren. Okay, there's only one high priest. He is the high priest, upon whose head the anointing oil is poured, showing that he has been set apart as the high priest of the people, that is consecrated to put on the garments. What garments are these? The very specific priestly garments, the ones that were specifically to be put on to go into that Holy of Holies, that inner part of the temple. Yes, sir.
How did one become a high priest? Was that an elected thing or what?
It was typically the firstborn son of the previous high priest. If he was faithful, and that he would become the high priest. And also, if if there had to be a choice between the two, God, of course, would make himself known and make his decision manifest. Yeah, or until he was no longer able to fulfill his duties. Many times they would say, I can't even walk anymore, so I certainly can't go into the temple or the tabernacle to do these things. Okay? All right, so he that is the high priest, and that is consecrated to put on the garments, those specific garments to the high priest, the ones that were specifically used for that point of time in the year when he would go and he would make offering for the children of Israel. Shall not let the hair of his head go loose, nor rend his clothes. What do you think it means? The hair of his head go loose. What does that mean? Yeah, he was to maintain his appearance. He was not to, the idea of let his hair go loose, it was not to cut it in a particular, a specific fashion to call attention to himself. The attention was brought to him because of the clothes that he wore, not because of the way that he shaved his head or cut his head in an unusual fashion. That's what it means by not letting the hair of his head go loose. Nor rend his clothes. Meaning what? Tear his clothes. To bring attention to himself by ripping his clothing. There's such a thing as, and this is still in regards to the idea of for someone who is dead, for someone who has passed. Okay, so the idea here is making a show of grief. Now you think, what difference does it make how he shows his grief? Why is it important that this high priest show his grief in a particular fashion, or rather, not show his grief in a particular fashion? Why would that be? Why would that even be a thing? Why would that be necessary? Okay. Yeah. He was to comport himself in such a way that other people that may be excused in their behavior, but for the high priest it was not to be excused. He was to comport himself in a particular fashion, in a particular way. And we think, well, that seems kind of unfair. It's not unfair. God said it. It's not unfair. If God tells you to, if God says for us to do something, there's nothing unfair about it. It's our version of what's fair is sometimes what's skewed, what's warped, is our version of what's fair. And our vision, I want to do this. I feel like I should be able to do this because that's what I want to do. Well, God says, no, this is what you were to do. And we have no right to say, well, I understand that's what he says, but that's not very fair. God is the definition of fair. God is a just God. And when God tells us to do something, we accept it as that's just, that's fair. That's what we need to be worried about. Okay, so he says, he shall not rend his clothes, neither shall he go into any dead body, nor defile himself for his father or for his mother, neither shall he go out of the sanctuary, nor profane the sanctuary of his God, for the crown of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. Now look at the difference between how the high priest is to behave versus how a regular priest, a rank and file priest was to behave. There are certain things that the high priest was specifically enjoined from doing, where the other priests were able to do those things. They were able to defile themselves. And we got to be careful about using the term defile meaning sin or doing something that's against God's will. The idea of defiling means taking something that is normal and making it that we're not engaging in normal behavior anymore. That's the idea of defiling here. Because the priest was allowed to defile himself for those who were close to his own family. But what does it say about the high priest? There are certain things he couldn't do. Let the hair of his head go loose, rend his clothes, neither shall he go into any dead body, nor defile himself. So the high priest was enjoined from doing that. He had to maintain his position no matter who passed, whether it was his father or his mother or any of his family members. He had to behave in a certain way where the other priests were allowed to behave in certain ways. He had to keep from doing that. For the crown of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. He is special. He is separate apart. Even from the priesthood, he was a different man than the regular priest. I am Jehovah, and he shall take a wife in her virginity, a woman that's not known another man. A widow or one divorced or a profane woman, a harlot, these shall he not take. So once again, another thing that was very specific for the high priest that may not have been bound upon the regular priesthood. These shall he not take, but a virgin of his own people shall he take to wife. Now, what does it mean by a virgin of his own people? Who are his own people? The tribe. Not just Israelites, because every Israelite was enjoined from taking wives from the surrounding nations. But the high priest was specifically to take a woman from the tribe of Levi, not from anyone else. And he shall not profane his seed among his people, for I am Jehovah who sanctifieth him. All right? Okay. So it tells us that the high priest was sanctified in a special way, a special anointing oil that set him apart as a high priest of his people. So he was separate. He was special even amongst the priesthood. All right. Okay. Verse 16. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron, saying, Whoever he be of thy seed throughout their generation, that hath a blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. So who's he talking about here when he's speaking to Aaron? Whosoever he be of thy seed. Who is he talking about here? The Levites. Those who were Levitical. Those who were of the Levitical priesthood. The Levites were they were special, not that they were more loved, but they were special in that they are set apart. They occupied a very peculiar position, an unusual position amongst the tribes. How does that how does that speak to us today? Okay, we are a holy priesthood. We are a spiritual priesthood, not a physical priesthood as the Levites were. We're a spiritual priesthood. There are things that are enjoined to us to obey that the rest of the world doesn't obey. They just don't obey them. What are some of the things that we're enjoined? What do we have to refrain from, or what must we do as a spiritual priesthood that the rest of the world doesn't follow? Okay. What else? What else? Anything else? What about marriage? What do we do? How do we, do we marry? Yep, we marry. Are there specific laws in Christ that are set for us as marriage? Yep, absolutely. What God has joined together in a spiritual relationship, man's not supposed to separate. But does the world separate? Yeah, on an alarming basis. Certainly so. Okay, so he gives specific instructions to the Levitical, the tribe of Levi. Oh, another thing about the Levites, did the tribe of Levi were they part of the land inheritance? They were not. There was not a part of the area, of the nation of Israel, land-wise, that was set apart for the Levitical, the tribe of Levi. What did they do? They lived wherever, and the people who lived in that area were to support them through the sacrifices and through bringing tithes. Okay.
One thing about
Yes.
members of the church, youth prophet, have been in a group where you might be talking, somebody says, "Oh, you remember the Church of Christ?" And we don't have to go around carrying the Bible, bringing outward appearance to ourselves.
No, you're right.
Can be a member, this is hope, but there's something about us we become material. I've been not with my quote, but just put in the conversation, and I say something. Oh, you must be members of the Church of Christ, and they say it in a negative way because they think we're rejected. Oh, you believe only one is going to be saved. It's always from a negative
Right,
way when they
right.
approach it. But there's something about us that's peculiar, the way we talk. Oh, you must be members of the Church of Christ who believe the only one is going to be saved.
Absolutely. I've been involved in online discussions, and somebody posts something, and there's something that just, the way they say that and the way they phrase it just makes me think, and I have to private message them, just to ask you, where do you attend services? And almost without exception, they'll tell me, oh, I attend the such and such Church of Christ and somewhere else. But there's something very peculiar about the Lord's church. And there should be. I mean, we should be unusual. When we speak, people should look at us, I can't believe they believe that. Well, because that's what the Bible tells us to believe. And we don't sell our salvation cheaply, if at all, certainly. Okay. All right, so if he hath a blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. But you look at the idea of here, it's a physical blemish. Okay, their heart could be pure, but he says because there's a physical blemish, They are not supposed to approach and serve in that way in the idea of sacrifice. They had a very specific, God had something in mind when there were certain people that were obliged to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. Much in the same way today, when we come to make our offering, how are we supposed to do that? With a pure heart, right? When we come and partake of the Lord's Supper, how do we do that? With a pure heart. He takes the idea of the physical blemish and then changes it to the idea of a spiritual blemish. Doesn't mean that we have to be sinless. It just means it means our heart has to be right. Our heart has to be contrite. Our heart has to be penitent in order to serve God rightly. It's essential. We cannot go and say, well, I'm serving God, but still have sin in our heart and live a certain way, even though we say we're serving in a certain way. We're not entitled to that. That's not fair. God is a just God. So what are some of the things he says? Right. Yep. And he was very particular. He was very particular. Was he not? When he talked about the animal, it was supposed to be a specific type of animal for a specific type of sacrifice. It was supposed to look a specific way. There were things that were not to be allowed. Okay, there were parts of that animal, and if you didn't have an animal in your flock that fit that, you found an animal that fit that. Whatever it took, that's what you did in order to accomplish this sacrifice to God. But here he's talking about the priesthood. There are certain people that were not allowed to offer sacrifice. It didn't mean that they couldn't serve as priests. It means that they couldn't offer the sacrifice. What are some of those things? He who hath a blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God, meaning the sacrifice to God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach. A blind man, or a lame, he that hath a flat nose, or anything superfluous, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or crook-back, or a dwarf, or that hath a blemish in his eye, or a scurvy, or scabbed, or hath his stones broken, no man of the seed of Aaron the priest that hath a blemish shall come nigh to offer the offerings of Jehovah made by fire. He hath a blemish, he shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God. Okay, so a laundry list of things that he felt was unacceptable. All right, so let's think about this. We start looking at these specifically. What do these individual things mean? Whoever hath a blemish, this is sort of a blanket thing. And it would be, some blemishes are very evident. You look at a man and you look and you see, okay, there's a blemish. It does not mean that he was not acceptable to God. It didn't mean that his sacrifices were not acceptable to God. It simply meant that he was not allowed to make those sacrifices on behalf of the people. He could serve in other capacities as a priest, but he could not offer sacrifice. As the sacrifice was holy, so must the man making the sacrifice, or as the sacrifice was without blemish, I should say, the man making the sacrifice must be without blemish. So, whoever hath a blemish, he that hath a flat nose. There's a couple of renditions of this. One of them renders it a split or a mutilated face. The idea of what? What might be what we would consider to be a mutilated face. Not necessarily by physical hands, but by as we're born. Cleft palate. Yep. One that you've seen people that have the nose is malformed, or it's the part of it's misshapen. That's what he's talking about here. And we think, well, how? That's not fair. Now let me ask you this: how many times have you heard people say, "I have a gift, and I should be allowed to exercise this gift and worship to God. I have a beautiful singing voice. Why can I not stand before the congregation and sing a solo song for God? Why would that not be acceptable? I have a gift. I have the ability to do it. God has said you're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to sing as a group. Yeah, but I have a gift. Well, these people, these men had a gift. They were able to do this, but God said, that's not what I want. That's not what I require from you. These people are enjoined from doing this. You're not to do this. Why do we think that we're any more special? When God has said, this is what I'm asking, this is not acceptable, we don't have the right to say, that's not fair. I should have the right to do something that I think I have a gift for. I have a gift for speaking. Well, I'm sorry, but it specifically says that we're not to have women are to keep silent in the assembly in the idea of a public speaker. Well, I have a gift. That's not the point. We can't look at that and say, well, that's not fair. God said it. It doesn't matter whether we think it's fair or not. That's what he wants. So he gives us this list. He who hath a flat nose or split or a mutilated face.
One of the things that people criticize about the church is the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Women should be.
Sure.
God has ordained.
There are people who said, I know I'm not of the tribe of Levi, but I think I could be just as good a priest. You know what? All things being equal, they probably could be. But that doesn't matter. You're not of the tribe of Levi. You have no right to that priesthood. Okay? Yeah. Anything superfluous. The idea of having 6 fingers as opposed to 5. Okay? Having just something that's extra that you shouldn't have more than a certain amount of. You have more than that, you're enjoined from doing this. Okay? Crook back and dwarf. Now, we think of these as very kind of obvious what it means. Some translations, the New English Bible talks about the term may relate to the eyebrows or to the eyes. In other words, cross-eyed, or having what we commonly refer to as a lazy eye, one that's not, where you can't see like this. You have one that's off to the side like this. Nope, they're enjoined from serving in this way. Did you put a razor to it?
No.
It's naturally. Then that's not. Yeah, you're all right. You're all right. But it certainly make perfect sense about the idea of being crooked back or a dwarf, someone who is hunched over, someone who's not able to stand erect, someone who is not of what we consider to be normal stature, someone who is literally a dwarf, someone who is a little person. They would be enjoined from the priesthood. We think, well, hard to believe that there were people like that back then. Of course there were. I mean, nature's always been unfortunately playing tricks on human beings. So we're born with a child that's got this instead of this, and that happens. But as much as we might think, they would make a great high priest, they would make a great priest. No. All right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Remember, they even asked Jesus, "Who was this man? Did this man sin, or did his parents sin that he be born blind?" Neither one. God didn't punish that child because his parents sinned. He didn't cause this young man to be born blind because he'd been blind from birth. He didn't sin. He certainly couldn't have sinned, and his parents didn't sin. That's just unfortunately the way the world works sometimes. We're born with certain problems, and once again, while this man his sacrifice would have been acceptable, and even his service in the priesthood would have been acceptable, his serving as a serving as the one who offers up that sacrifice would have been unacceptable to God. So he was very specific. The idea of having his stones broken. This is the idea of castration. Okay, his masculine equipment had to be working. It couldn't be whether by his hand or whether by somebody else's hand. Everything had to work. And once again, that gets in the idea of God's desire for the marriage relationship. Same thing with the priesthood. Okay. Those things, someone who had been ritualistically castrated would have been unacceptable. Okay. And they said there's eunuchs that were made eunuchs by someone else, themselves, or nature. They were born eunuch. Those men would have been unacceptable to serve in the capacity that we're offering up here. Okay. But they would have been used in other ways. There were many offices of a priest. There were many jobs for a priest to do. But offering up sacrifice was not one of them. Okay. Okay. So let's finish up with that one, and we'll get on into the next chapter. All right. Leviticus 22. I believe it's 22. Yes. All right. This chapter concludes this third section of Leviticus that started back in actually Leviticus chapter 11, the idea of uncleanness and putting away, and this is going to finish that up. So let's go ahead and begin. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and his sons, that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, which they hallow unto me, and that they profane not my holy name. I am Jehovah. So once again, he enjoins them. There are things that make you unclean. You're not to associate with those things, especially as priests of God. You're not to engage in those things. Put them away. I am Jehovah, saying to them, Whosoever he be of all your seed throughout your generations that approacheth unto the holy things which the children of Israel hallow unto Jehovah, that make them holy, that they're sanctified, they're sacrificed to Jehovah, having his uncleanness upon him, that soul shall be cut off from before me. I am Jehovah. What man soever of the seed of Aaron is a leper, or hath an issue, he shall not eat of the holy things until he be clean. And whoso toucheth anything that is unclean by the dead, or a man whose seed goeth from him, or whosoever toucheth any creeping things whereby he may be unclean. Now these have already been enumerated. He's already told them, this makes you unclean. You know, the idea of the dead. Does that make them sinful? No, certainly not. Touching the dead didn't make them sinful. It made them ritually unclean. And they had to purify and make themselves clean again. You know, we think about that. Any Jew, any Hebrew, any Israelite who touched a dead body was made unclean. But guess what? You had to have people that would touch dead bodies, right? You couldn't allow a dead body to lay in somebody's house. Somebody had to go in and get that dead body, and they had to take it out, and they had to perform the things necessary to embalm or to inter that body. So there was certainly a need to do that. Even the priests, when somebody would come and they would present themselves to the priest, saying, I had a spot on me, and I need you to check it and make sure that I'm okay to go back and live in my own home again. That priest might have to touch that person in order to do that. If that leprosy or whatever that skin condition was is still there, by touching it, that priest had made himself unclean. Does that mean he makes him sinful and he's no longer able to serve God? No. It just means that there's something he had to do in order to be purified of that, a specific period of time. Typically, it was about 24 hours. But those things were necessary to do. They had to be able to touch and to look at and to touch the dead and to do all of these things. But here he's saying specifically, he shall not eat of the holy things until he is clean. So once he becomes clean again, he's able to go back in and begin service again. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. And whosoever toucheth anything that is unclean, or whosoever toucheth any creeping thing whereby he may be made unclean, or a man whom he may take uncleanness, whatsoever uncleanness he hath, the soul that toucheth any such shall be unclean until the evening. And he shall not eat of the holy things until he bathe his flesh in water. And when the sun is down, he shall be clean again. And afterwards he shall eat of the holy things, because it is his bread. What is he talking about here? The holy things, the things that are offered to God, right? Those things that are sacrificed to God. That's how the priests, in many cases, were fed. It was a man would bring an animal, he would sacrifice it to God, he would sacrifice it on the altar, and a good portion of the meat of that animal would be given to the priest. That's how they received their food. They didn't engage in all the commerce that the rest of the nation did. So that's how they fed themselves. But he's saying, if it's been offered to God, it's holy. You cannot eat of it until you have been made clean yourself. And in the evening, he would be clean again. He would be able to go in and eat the food that had been offered to God. And we think, how particular is that? I mean, how strict can that possibly, how much more strict can God possibly be? Well, how strict does he want to be? That's his decision to make. Okay? And if you look at it, it is certainly a type compared to what we are today. We're commanded not to, he even tells us before we come and bring our offering, if we have aught against a brother, what are we to do? We go make that right. If we have sin in our heart, can we come before God in this assembly and worship God if we have sin in our heart and not make that sin right? Is that the kind of worship God wants from us? Is that the kind of worship God demands from us? So, it's certainly a type. We are now, of course, that was the shadow. Now we are the real. But he's telling us as well, we can't be unclean and still worship God acceptably. We have to make things right, whether it's with God or whether it's with a brother or whatever it might be. We have to make things right in order for our worship to be acceptable to God. But this is just a physical aspect of what we do spiritually, certainly. Oh, it's certainly a physical, this is, yeah. There's a very physical aspect to it. I certainly, if just be honest, if I touched a man with leprosy, I don't know if I want to go in immediately and eat my food, you know. Even if I'm physically okay, even if I wash my hands, there's something about that just you know, ugh, okay? Touching a dead body. I mean, you know, you're sitting there touching a dead body, you're not going to eat a sandwich, are you? I mean, there's certain things that just make you feel a little, you know, uneasy. But this is a physical, the idea here is, of course, the physical thing. We're looking at the spiritual, you know. The things that are sacred to God are sacred to God, and we have no right to touch them if we are defiled, if we are unclean. Spiritually unclean, not physically, spiritually unclean. So we need to make ourselves spiritually clean in order to come to God and have Him look at us with favor. Certainly so. The good thing about it is we don't have to wait until the evening. We can make things right immediately with God. That's the beautiful thing about it. If God has aught against us, or we have aught against another brother, we can take care of that straight away and not have to worry about being ritualistically clean. We can immediately become spiritually clean just by going to God in prayer, repenting, and making things right.
You know, one of the things, people want to make God the way they think they make God. And that's why with the things that are in the Word of God, we got to break God in a spiritual way. But they think this book is a hate book because they don't understand. But they want to make God to their level. And they don't understand who God really is.
Well,
so
yeah.
they're so confused. So I don't understand this book. I can't serve a God like this.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're trying to say, people who don't understand the Word of God want to bring God down to their level. And, you know, God is supreme. And we have to look at it that way. We can't look at God as somebody God level, like what you mentioned, Papa, Daddy God, and all this other stuff, bring them down and use these terms.
Yeah.
You know.
The idea, I think part of it goes right into the idea. There's two trains of thought. One is that we are God-like, therefore God is like us. You know, we are gods. We are God-like, which means that God is basically the same as we are. He has the same thought process as we do. But what does the Scripture say about our thoughts? God's thoughts are what? So much higher than ours. The way He thinks, the way He looks at things is so much higher than we are. And we think, how can we possibly achieve that lofty status? Well, the truth is we can't. But the good thing about it is God is not asking us to be God-like. He's asking us to be godly. So that's a whole different thing. Another one is that, there's that one. Then there's the other one that says that any God who would make that kind of a law or think that way about people or make this sort of commandment and go through all of this stuff, and they always go to Leviticus, they always go to the old law. If God is a God that makes this kind of law that I can't live my life the way I want, then I don't want any part of Him. He's not a very good God. Now, I've never understood this. See, this flies in the face of logic. If you admit that God is who He says He is, and that God is supreme, and that God has made these laws, the idea that you would say, I believe that He is, and you know, but I just can't abide by His rules and His regulations, His statutes, His covenants, all of these things. I cannot abide by those things. It flies in the face of logic that you would basically say, my current condition, my current lifestyle is more important than an eternal life with God. Even if you didn't agree with His commandments, why would you not obey them simply because they come from one that you already are admitting is God? It flies in the face of logic. It makes no sense. But it's the same way as people say, you know, I know the law is this, but I would much rather just continue in doing exactly what I'm doing, and you know, if I take consequences for it, I take consequences for it. Especially when it's something that's not that big of an issue. You know, and especially when people that are not even necessarily involved in that particular lifestyle, they're going to turn their back on God, even though they're not even involved. It makes no difference to them. It's not affecting them in any way, shape, or form. But because God said so, and I disagree with it, therefore I dismiss God altogether. But that's the illogic, you know, the fallacy of human beings as opposed to God. All right. When the sun is down, he shall be clean, and afterward he shall eat of the holy things, because it is his bread. So he's telling them, this too shall pass. Even if you are unclean, you will be made clean again. In the evening, you are once again clean, and you can eat of those holy things, that bread, that meat, the things that are offered up to God. That which dieth of itself, or is torn of beast, he shall not eat, to defile himself therewith. I am Jehovah. They shall therefore keep my charge, lest they bear sin for it and die therein. If they profane it, let me read this correctly. They shall therefore keep my charge, lest they bear sin for it and die therein, if they profane it. Separate statement. I am Jehovah who sanctifieth them. The idea, of course, dying of itself or torn of beasts. This is in a direct. It draws a contrast between an animal that is slain on the altar and one that dieth of itself. God said that the animal that dies on the altar is to be brought to that altar with that specific purpose, and it is to be killed there, not killed and brought in later. They take it up on that altar and they kill it at that point, and it's not torn to pieces. It was very simple. I watched basically a reenactment of this, and it was a very clean, very precise, it was almost, I hate to say this, but it was almost beautiful to watch, because they were very respectful of the animal. They didn't take the thing and tear it apart. They didn't just stab it a bunch of times to bleed it out. It was a very quick, and they would lay their hand on that animal as they're getting ready to sacrifice it. They'd put their head on top of that, whatever it was, and the priest would take an extremely sharp blade, and he would draw it across, and they would bleed it out immediately. Now, you think about that. How much better would that be than an animal being torn apart by other wild animals? I mean, it's almost like there's a very short pain, very quick, but then it's just a slow, basically the life ebbs out, and the animal it's a very peaceful death compared to a great many. You know, it was a very respectful attitude towards the animal. The reason being is that animal is dedicated to God. They took it very seriously. It was not something that was, they gave no thought to. This was a very precious thing for them. It wasn't, well, here's another sacrifice, let's get it over with and get out of here. No, it was very, very honorable, very beautiful thing to watch, all things considered. I know the idea of for some people doing that, but you think about that, how important this was. This was not just to offer up, this is not just so that the priest could have food. This was a gift to God, and it was brought with all of the honor and respect that could be mustered in bringing an animal before God. I wish sometimes that many people who eat of the bread and drink of the cup and offer up their financial offering to God, I wish everybody could go at it with the same respectful attitude that they did when they offered up sacrifice. Because I've seen people, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but I've seen people when they've done communion, I've watched people and you think, I don't even know if they're really thinking about what they're doing, just based on their physical activity. They're talking and laughing and making jokes and it just doesn't seem to be very respectful. Now that's the way I look at it. That's the way I see. I don't try to divine their hearts, but that certainly sometimes is the case. But if we could be as respectful of that, because why? Why should we be as respectful? It's a sacrifice. Yeah, it's a sacrifice. What we're observing here is a sacrifice that was made 2,000 years ago, with all of the respect that's due. Now, the interesting thing is, if you think about the respect that was offered up to, even the respect that was offered up to those animals that were offered up on that altar, look at the contrast between the sacrifice of those animals and the sacrifice of Christ. It was not a what's that? It was not a compassionate, respectful thing. He was torn apart, basically, torn apart by wild beasts. Had people who were whipping him, scourging him, pressing that crown of thorns, and it was the difference between the two is it's unimaginable. But anyway, so he says, you're not to eat anything that died in and of itself or was torn apart by wild beasts. You're not supposed to eat that to defile yourself. All right? It would be a dead animal. It would be the same thing as finding what we would call roadkill. We wouldn't dare put something like that in our mouth, at least if we're smart. Something that's been sitting out on the Georgia asphalt for, a day in 100-degree heat. You wouldn't take that home and put it on a plate. And you certainly wouldn't put it on a plate and offer it up to a guest. At least not if you want to continue to be friends with them. If I found out that, I come to your house, this was, this is good venison. Yeah, we found this on the road a couple of days ago, and I think it's only been sitting there for a couple of days. I think we should be fine. No, there's a way that it was supposed to be offered up, and a way that it was supposed to be sacrificed that was very particular in the way God wanted it to happen. All right? Let's see. In verse 10. There shall be no stranger eat of the holy thing. A sojourner of the priests or a hired servant shall not eat of the holy thing. So here he's talking about this that's been offered up to God, that's been given to the priests in order to sustain them. There are certain people that were not allowed to eat of it. It was particular to them. Some of those are a sojourner, someone who is visiting, a visitor or a guest, was not allowed to eat of those things. Or a hired servant, one who he paid to work for him. But those who were slaves, those who were bought with his money, were considered part of his household. They were allowed to eat of those things. But if any priest buys any soul, which is talking about here a bought servant or a slave, the purchase of his money, that person is allowed to eat of it, and such as are born of his house or his family, they shall eat of his bread. And if the priest's daughter be married unto a stranger, she shall not eat of the heave offerings of the holy things. But if a priest's daughter be a widow or divorced and have no child and be returned to her father's house, as in her youth, she shall eat of her father's bread. She is still considered part of his family. If her husband dies, she moves back in with her father. She lives there. She is part of his household again. If she's still married, she's part of her husband's household. That's a separate thing altogether. Okay. So once again, giving them very specifics. But there shall be no stranger eat thereof. Why is that? There's a thing about that, right? If it's a stranger, they may not be of the priesthood. A stranger could be someone who's visiting, just a visitor from from another place. And if they're not part of that particular Levitical priesthood, they weren't allowed to eat of those holy things. Those were separate. They were set apart for God and for the sustaining of the priesthood. All right? And if a man eat of the holy thing unwittingly, then he shall put the fifth part thereof unto it, and shall give unto the priest the holy thing. Now, basically, he's giving them an allowance if somebody does this unknowingly. You walk into the priest's home, and there's food that's sitting there, and you avail yourself of the food. You have no idea. It's not intentional. You're not intentionally trying to offend God, but you eat of the food. And he says, mistakes happen, but this is what you have to do in order to make that up. So he gives them specific instructions on how to make up for eating that food that was specifically for the service of God. He shall put the fifth part thereof unto it, and shall give unto the priest the holy thing. So he's to make restitution. And they shall not profane the holy things of the children of Israel, which they offer unto Jehovah. Those things are they're sacred. They're set apart for God. And so cause them to bear the iniquity that bringeth guilt when they eat their holy things. For I am Jehovah who sanctifies them. They're set apart. Okay? We'll go just a couple more minutes and then we're going to be done. All right? In verse 17. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and to his sons and to all the children of Israel, and say unto them, Whosoever he be of the house of Israel, or of the sojourners in Israel, that offereth his oblation, whether it be any of their vows or any of their freewill offerings, which they offer unto Jehovah for a burnt offering, that ye may be accepted, ye shall offer a male without blemish of the bullocks, of the sheep, or of the goats. But whatsoever hath a blemish, that shall ye not offer, for it shall not be acceptable for you. Now, here he's talking about specifically for the priesthood, but remember, he's already made mention of this for the children of Israel, right? The average Hebrew, the one that's bringing these offerings to God, he says, of the animals that you offer, they're not to have any blemish. Well, here he basically repeats this, but he's talking about specifically for the priests. Because did the priests have to offer up their own offerings? They weren't sacred just because they were priests. They still had to offer to God. They had to offer all of their sacrifices, same as every other Hebrew, Just like a preacher. I'm just saying, as a preacher's not exempt from offering up on the first day of the week just because he's the preacher and he receives his pay from the church. He's still obligated to give of his means. Same thing as this. The priests were still obligated to offer up offerings that were necessary to God. And they weren't excused from that simply because they were priests. That would have been very convenient, would it not? And once again, remember when we talked about those things, a man's sacrifice had to come from that man. It could not be offered up on his behalf by somebody else. Now, understand this. One of the nice things about bringing a preacher is it's actually kind of nice. Every once in a while, we'll get together with some people, and somebody will say, I'll buy your lunch, preacher. I always appreciate that. That's always very nice. But I'm not excused from buying my own meal simply because I'm a preacher or I'm a minister somewhere. Same thing with the priests. They weren't excused from their offerings simply because they were priests. They still committed trespass, they still committed sin, and they still had to offer up the things that were necessary in order for that to be in order for that sin to be removed. Okay, but here he's saying very specifically, that's what this is what you're supposed to offer, and it is, once again, as the rest of the congregation, it is supposed to be without blemish. Very specifically. All right, blind or broken, or maimed, or having a wen, or scurvy, or scabbed, ye shall not offer these unto Jehovah, nor make an offering by fire of them upon the altar unto Jehovah. All right, we'll stop there. All right. So, once again, these are specific instructions to the priesthood. They were sanctified, they were set apart from the rest of the congregation, but they had obligations, they had instructions, they had commandments that were specific to them. Very specific. But it was, once again, it was the point of showing their position amongst the children of Israel. He said, I've not given you land, but I've given you a position. But don't think that this position exempts you from being as you're supposed to be. You're not exempted from a specific behavior simply because you're the priest. You have an obligation to the children of Israel. And this is one of the biggest problems that the nation of Israel had, is its priests. They did not behave in such a way that would bring honor to God. They had gone into, in many cases, idolatry. They were taking wives from outside of their own tribe, which was forbidden the priests. All of these things. So, as was happening then, does that still happen today as the priesthood, the royal priesthood, as a holy nation? Yeah, we still do things, unfortunately, that lump us right in there with the world. And when we do that, we cannot very well expect the world to say, you know what, I want to hear what you have to say. Because they're saying, why would I listen to you? You're just like me. There's no difference between me and you, except that you say you belong to a church. So we've got to be careful about that. Anything? Anybody got anything they want to say? Any commentary? Okay. All right. We'll finish this up next week, and we'll continue on. Hopefully, go ahead and get through this. There's not a lot left. We've only got a few short chapters left before we're going to finish up our year-long study of Leviticus. So I'm looking forward to it. All right. We're going to offer up the invitation. If anyone needs the prayers of the congregation, we certainly want to pray in any way, for any reason. If you have that need, please come while we stand and while we sing.